So welcome everyone. So this is our last seminar this semester, and we are very happy to have Pauline from University of New South Wales.
Sorry, I just need to get a watch because I don't have a watch. I'll be
okay. All right. So Pauline has been working in the area of institution, culture, and how institution and culture affect economic development and individual behavior. So let's take some time and wait till she comes back with her watch.
Okay.
All right. Okay, she's back. Okay, so and today she's going to share her research with us. As you can see from the slides, it's entitled Heroes and Villains, the Effect of Compact Heroism on Autocratic Values and Nazi Collaboration in France. Sounds like a very interesting topic. Okay, so Pauline, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the effect of heroism on autocratic values and Nazi collaboration, taking the example of the Second World War. And I'm going to talk a lot about this guy here on the left that many of you may not know, but whose name is Philippe Pétain, who is the head of the collaborationist government in France during World War II. And you can see him shaking hands with Hitler in 1940. And the guy in the back is Hitler's translator. So this is joint work with Julia Cagé, who's at Sciences Po, Anna Dagorret, who's a second-year PhD student at GSB at Stanford, and Saumitra, who's at Stanford. So the broad motivation for this work is a very interesting context where French democracy committed suicide. So in July 1940, what was and is still one of the most durable democracies in the world committed suicide by voting full power to Marshal Pétain. So the French Parliament voluntarily ended sovereignty by voting full power to this guy, Pétain, who was a marshal, and in particular, who was the hero of the Great War, so a hero of the First World War. And one of the reasons that motivated the vote is that this heroic war marshal was gonna save France once again from the Germans, as he had done a few years before during the First World War. But instead, what he did was put in place an authoritarian, conservative, and repressive regime that would collaborate with Nazi Germany until France's liberation in June 1944. And as I said, one of the reasons that motivated the vote of the assembly and also explains a lot of the popular support behind Pétain was the fact that there was this idea that dictatorship by a historic war hero was necessary for France's national renewal. So the question that we ask in this paper is, trying to understand the role and the mechanism through which heroic credentials can play in legitimizing political values. And we're going to take in this example, the legitimization of values that represented a rupture with social and previous social and political order. So we say, legitimizing values that would have otherwise been seen as controversial or even repugnant, in this case, collaboration with an avowed enemy, and also legitimizing and propagating authoritarian values. And of course, if we think about the political roles that heroes can play, or political and social roles that heroes can play, it's very hard to identify the effect of heroism per se, because the emergence of heroes, the networks of their followers, and their actions are endogenous in general to the context that calls for heroes. So what's interesting in our context is that this is a very unique situation where Pétain, so the head of state's heroic credentials, had been pre-established some more than 30 years before in the context of another war. And throughout France, we had individuals who were themselves heroes who had been arbitrarily tied to Pétain. And so what we're going to use to, that generates this situation is the fact that in the First World War, regiments of the line infantry had been arbitrarily rotated under his personal command at the very important historical battle of Verdun in 1916. And so what we're going to find is that the municipalities that are home to the regiments that were rotated under his command at a particular battle of Verdun in 1916 were more likely to collaborate during World War II. And we're going to document that this is quite a large effect. So it's, around an 8.5% increase in the local density of collaborators on average. And we're going to also show that this was accompanied by a durable shift in political values that had started to materialize during the interwar and persisted, up until in the post-Second World War. And in terms of the mechanism, I'm going to try and convince you that we have the legitimization of values. So it's not, I'm not arguing here that they're necessarily anti-democratic, but it's just the fact that they were the values of Pétain himself, and they just happen to be anti-democratic. And I'm going to show you that, these values were legitimized and diffused through this exogenous network of heroes that had been arbitrarily tied to him throughout the rotation in the First World War. And I'm going to also
Pauline, can I just check? Sorry, yeah. Pauline, can I just check? When you mean collaboration, you mean the French collaborating with the Nazis?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm going to, I'm going to talk to you about what forms this could take. So we actually have very good data on the different forms that it could take. So I'm going to talk about direct Nazi collaboration. So that's joining the Gestapo or joining the SS or the Wehrmacht. But it could also be joining a fascist political party that was, pro-Germany, but also pro-Pétain's government. Or it could be a violent paramilitary organization that operated within France and hunted Jews and the resistance. And it's also economic collaboration, so deep economic collaboration. And I'm also going to talk to you about some complementarity in the networks that explain, some of the results, and in particular, this idea of escalating commitments that we see, first through political values and then some kind of very extreme political action that people are taking, right? So typically, we're going to observe people who go and voluntarily join the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front in 1944. So this is, you're going to be pretty committed to do that. I mean, at that point, it's very clear that Germany is losing the war. Okay, so in terms of contributions to the existing literature, well, so we're arguing that we're kind of the first paper to look at this, at the empirical political economy of heroism. So this is why this bullet point is purposely left blank. But more generally, we are contributing to the literature on democratic values and how democracies fail. And there's been a literature on this, but in terms of empirical literature, it's mostly in the context of the Nazis in interwar Germany and the role that propaganda may have taken, or how Hitler was able to leverage local organizations. But Germany in the 1930s is a quite different situation than France in the 1940s, in the sense that France is a much longer-lived democracy at that point. And in the theoretical literature, there is this idea that democracy becomes more resilient as it survives. So, you've got a number of papers that argue that, institutions change cultural values. And so you've got this coevolution of democratic institutions and democratic political values. So that these two things are mutually reinforcing. In our case, what's interesting is that we really see the example of a very long-standing democracy that was supplanted by autocracy in the face of an alternative source of legitimacy. And I also want to stress that Pétain was not a charismatic leader or a clever operator of internal politics. The source of his legitimacy was very different. It was, as we argued, heroism. So in that, we also contribute to the literature on leadership. And of course, I sort of hinted at this already in the context of heroism. The problem of this literature of leadership is that leaders and their followers, they are endogenous to the context that you look at. So there is a paper in the AER now by Dippel and Heblisch looking at the influence of exiled leaders of the 1848 German revolutions. So you had these leaders of the revolution in Germany, and they got expelled, and they arrive in the US, and they observe how the political role that these people play in mobilizing towns in the American Civil War. So in that paper, they solve the reflection problem, right? So they have these pre-existing leaders that arrive somewhere, but they don't really solve the problem that they can endogenously sort themselves in different places. Whereas our paper is different because we are going to use an exogenous network, right? So what determines links to Pétain are determined what community you're born in. So its community is determined at birth, sorry. And another thing as well is that we're going to look at links to a national political leader, all right? So they look at these local leaders, whereas our context is quite different because it's links to a national political leader. Yeah, I've got a question here, I think. I don't think I can hear you.
Sorry, I had difficulty finding the unmute button. How democracies fail? One way they fail is they get invaded by non-democratic countries. Just how legitimate is it to characterise the French circumstance as a failure of democracy when you're effectively in an occupied country?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you. And I think I need to be a bit more precise with the historical context, and I will be in a few slides. But, France didn't have to put in place a collaborationist regime, right? They could have done what Poland did or what other occupied country did. What the Netherlands did was to have a legitimate government in exile, right? So stay committed to democratic values, but just choose exile. And that's, many people in the French government advocated for this. But then in the end, they chose a different route, which was to vote full power to Marshal Pétain. And another thing I think that I want to stress that's very important is that Hitler could not have cared less about what French authorities did in France, right? So the National Revolution, which was what Pétain put in place, this authoritarian conservative system, that's a very indigenous decision by the French to put in place this regime. Hitler wanted to occupy France. He wanted to defeat France, right? Because to get revenge of the loss of the First World War. And he wanted to exploit France economically. But what the French did beyond that, he had very little interest in, what they were doing. So it's not, there were other choices open to France. I agree that it was very difficult circumstances, but there were other choices open to it. And our last contribution is to, the determinants of collaboration in Nazi-occupied Europe. And in terms of the historical literature, there's been a literature that's been mostly qualitative, but of course, very little quantitative evidence. And one of the reasons for that is that data is very hard to come by. And if we look at the economics literature on conflict, most of this literature deals with insurgencies or the effect of fighting, with the government. So it has more an interest on this insurgency rather than who's going to collaborate with with either the government or an occupying power. And one of the reasons, again, is that it's very hard to get the data, right? And specifically in the case of France, it's very easy to get data on the resistance and very difficult to get data on collaboration. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a lot of the history of France in the first interwar and Second World War, and then talk about the data and the results. But I think what's very important to understand for people who are not French and who don't know these things is the importance of the Battle of Verdun for the First World War. So I think as Australians or Americans or more people who know more the English side of things, you may not have heard of this battle because I think there is much more of a focus on the Battle of the Somme. But not just before the Somme, but in the same year that the Battle of the Somme happened, a battle which, for France is a lot more important, happened, is the Battle of Verdun. So Verdun has been described as the worst and longest battle in history by historians. So it's also important to understand the differences for France in the First World War compared to Australia or Britain. So France, first of all, had universal conscription. So every man between the ages of 18 and 40 were mobilized during the war. It was compulsory. And of course, there's been a lot of military deaths, right? So on average, the death rate for the average French municipality is around 4%. There's 1.3 million military deaths in France. And within the First World War, the battle that is the most important for France is Verdun. So Verdun is a specific place in France that already had a huge symbolic importance then, and even more in its aftermath. And it's described by many historians as the turning point of World War I. So it was largely unanticipated. So, you can read, we read this, the diary of French High Command, or, the outcome of their meetings. And on the 8th of February, 1916, French High Command reckons that a German attack on the French front seems improbable. Yet, a few days later, on February 21st, the German attack and starts what was to become the longest continuous battle in history. Verdun is going to last for 10 months, from February 21st to December 18th, 1916. And because of the length of the battle and the scale, 90% of the line infantry is going to be rotated through Verdun at some point. And it really becomes the symbol of French determination and sacrifice. And eventually, France wins, in part thanks to the Battle of the Somme that happens in the summer of 1916, and that diverts German attention. But, I think it's widely agreed that the Germans had a chance to win the war before Verdun, and that chance dwindled away over the 10 months of the Battle of Verdun. So within Verdun, the person who is that becomes the most important is this Pétain person. So at the start of the war, he's a bit of a nobody. So he's a simple colonel he's 58, and he's about to retire. And the Battle of Verdun is so catastrophic that in the first 5 days of the battle, 4 generals are sacked. So almost one a day. And the one who's next in line is Pétain. So there is this snap decision to name him after the sacking of previous generals. And, the reason why it's him is that there was in truth no one else. And, the anecdote to show you how unanticipated by him it was, is that when he's put in charge of the battle, they don't know where he is. And they have to, his aide de camp eventually managed to find him, and they have to fetch him in a hotel in Gare du Nord in Paris, where he's spending the night with his mistress, and he has to leave precipitously and take command of the battle at 0 hour. You were supposed to laugh a bit at that, because it's like kind of super cliche and stuff. Anyway, so he's put in charge of the battle on the 26th of February, and he stays in command of the battle until the 1st of May, and he really turns the battle around. So one thing that he does is that he puts in place this Noria rotation that has troops in the front line for 2 weeks, then rested, and then rotated back to the line. And that's in contrast with other generals' approach, or the Germans' approach, which is to keep a line infantry in the front line until it's literally grounded to 0. And he's also more defensive. He's more reliant on the artillery. He's a lot more sparing of human lives. And in particular, he's really an infantryman. So he's beloved by the infantry, and he's very often in the front line with the infantry. And, he pins he's also famous for pinning the medals on the men themselves. And there's many accounts that you can see that in the diaries of the infantry that we read through.
Only a quick question about that. Yeah. So can you give us some insights into why the 4 generals before him were sacked? Was it it was clearly a politically motivated move? Because
it wasn't political at all. It was just, it was a disaster. Mm-hmm. Like the Germans were advancing super fast. They took several, so Verdun is part of a fortified, there was this fortified cities in the east of France when Verdun is. Yeah. And in particular, there was a fort around Verdun, that is the Douaumont fort. It's very famous. And it was supposed to be impossible to take. And the Germans took it in half an hour. And that was impossible for the French to imagine that fort could be taken. And there is several forts like this that the Germans just took. And then, they could establish their defense line there. And so it was such a disaster that, they had, these generals were high command, which is like, how could you lose this battle? And they were firing those guys because they were inept, or perceived as inept. I mean, there, you know. Yeah.
Sorry, just to interrupt, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but is it not the fact that and it's not related directly, but just in relation to your previous comment, I mean, the reason the Germans can invade France so quickly is because the French literally had, is this World War I or World War II? I thought it was World War II, where they had their defenses all the way down and there's just a large gap. So
no, that's World War I. That's World War I. Yeah.
Fair enough. That makes sense. Fair enough.
So
sorry.
We're now in World War II, where you're right, there is a lot of the strategic decisions weren't great. So anyway, so as you know, World War II is a bit more known. So on the 3rd of September 1939, France declares war on Germany, and nothing happens for a few months. And then in 6 weeks, as you were just talking about, from the 10th of May 1940, German forces defeat Allied forces. And, you know, there is this thing, you know, that there was a line of defense that the Germans just went around, but that's a completely different story from this 45 fort in the First World War. And, you know, the First World War was a very slow war. You know, there was no tanks, even in 1916. I mean, they were just starting to appear. So, you know, it's a disaster for France and the Allies, and Pétain, who had refused to play a formal political role in the interwar, finally agrees to join the government on the 18th of May 1940 in the hope that his presence would restore morale to the French army, and then, you know, we would manage to turn the battle around again as we had done in Verdun. But it doesn't really work. And a few days after he's appointed prime minister, France signs the armistice. And, you know, a couple of weeks after that, as I was telling you in the first slide, he assumes plenipotentiary powers as head of state. And a few months later, he meets Hitler and justifies collaboration. So the government is moved to Vichy. So I'm going to, you know, refer to the Vichy government, which is a thermal town in France, because, you know, France is divided. So in the north, there is the occupied zone, and then there's a so-called free zone in the south with the town of Vichy here. But in practice, there is a lot of relationships between the north and the south. And there are actually political parties that are allowed to coexist and that are active in both zones. And then after, you know, 1942, November 1942, there is Germany invades the whole of France. And then there is very clear, explicit collaboration between the French government, which remains in place, and the German. And yeah, so what the French government or the Vichy government does is put in place this very authoritarian, reactionary, and traditionalist regime, you know, around what is called the National Revolution, and the motto of work, family, fatherland, that replaces, you know, liberty, equality, fraternity as the motto of the French Republic. So there is state-sponsored anti-Semitism very early on. So even before, you know, the implementation of the final solution, France puts in place very repressive laws against Jews. They insist, the French government, and there's actually archives that prove that, the French government, so under Pétain, insists on the deportation of Jewish children, which Germany didn't want to have deported. The French insists. So foreign Jews, because there is these differences between foreign and French Jews, but still. And also there is, you know, hunting of communists, resistance, and Freemason. Okay, so the collaboration data that we managed to get our hands on is a very unique data set that is very, you know, very little is known about this data. So it was collected in 1944, 1945 by the French counterintelligence, which was headed by this guy, Paul Payol, who actually I'm reading this biography, and he was the only Frenchman to know about the day of D-Day. So this is how much the British and the Americans trusted him. And him and his services collected this file on almost 100,000 living collaborators that were still living around in France in 1944, 1945. And so this is the list that we got. So there is a French qualitative historian who's not even an academic historian. He was working for a museum of the resistance. And he was that at the death of Paul Payol gave the list to someone who was the curator of the museum. So this guy happened to get in get his hands on the list and take pictures of the list. And we went to his basement to take pictures of the pictures that he had taken. So this list was kind of lost after the war. And then we heard about it in the trial of the famous trial of a collaborator in 1997. And then it was lost again, and it's supposed to be declassified, but it's not public. And I think it's possible to go into it's in the archives, and you can go and look at it, but you can't use it. But this, we're not, we're using a different version. So, and it's very detailed. So it's got the name of people, and then the first initials that you see here is the kind of collaborationist organization that they were in. So PPF here is a political party. MIL is the milice, which was a violent paramilitary organization. And then here, for example, you've got GO, which is Gestapo. So you got the name of people, what they did, and their address. So we can recover their gender for a lot of them. We have the date of birth for a few, but we have their location, and it's very granular, right? So we plotted the address of these collaborators, for example, on this tourist map of Paris that you may have come across. And this is very detailed information about where these people are. We know their place of birth if it's different from the location. So from these estimates, we've got about 15% of movers, which is consistent with what the census say and what they did. So as I said, like whether they're a member of a fascist party. So the main form, the highest in number is membership to a fascist political party. And the second highest is this violent paramilitary organization, the milice. And in terms of direct Nazi collaboration, the largest in number is like members of the Gestapo. And then we've got other political parties, other paramilitary organization, and then we've got other forms of direct Nazi collaboration. So like people who were in the SS or the security services of Germany. Yeah, Kenneth.
Yeah, these collaborators, they're traitors, if I'm not mistaken. So
not really.
Well, what are the stakes of either declaring yourself as a collaborator or unearthing someone who's a collaborator? What sort of reliability do you place on this list of yours?
So how much do I trust the list?
Yeah.
So So I trust the list because I can't see any reason for why it would have been manipulated, right? So the purpose of this list is to have the name of people who were suspected of collaboration or proven collaborators in the purpose of punishing them. I think in the end, nothing happened to these people or a lot of these people because it was just so many people. And if you look at the activities that they were doing, a lot of them were white collars, right? So I think if something had happened to these people, the whole social, build up of friends would have collapsed. It's a lot of people. So I got no reason to think that it was manipulated in any way. So they're traitors in 1945, but not necessarily in 1940, right? And in terms of how the list was collected, I think it's very hard to know systematically for every organization. But for these guys in the RNP here and in the PPF, the secretaries of these organizations were captured by the resistance, and they had the list of their members. So they come from the complete listing of their members that the resistance had, managed to capture during the war. For the milice, I don't know. So what we did is that for Paris, for example, we have the archives of the police, and we have the miliciens in Paris, and it's very, there was investigations about these people, right? So there is a specific, story of one man. He was suspected of being in the milice, and they asked several witnesses, right? So the police makes an inquiry about these people to know whether they're in the milice. So I think it's a bit more serious than just, having someone denounce their neighbors. Like they wouldn't found themselves on their list if it wasn't corroborated and known, by the resistance and corroborated with several witnesses that these people were collaborators. But yeah, it's 100,000 people. For the RNP and the PPF, we know that their secretaries were captured, and that's how they managed to get the list. But if you still have that, and I'm reading the biography of this guy Payol, for example, he has no link with Pétain himself. It's just, yeah, he was just the counterintelligence. He was the resistance. He was running these networks, but there's no reason to think that, municipalities that had stronger link to Pétain would find themselves on their list disproportionately. But I'll present to you some results based on other sources of data.
Thank you.
Okay, and so what we're going to do is that for the rest of the analysis is that we're not going to rely so much on the individual data, but we're going to, our level of analysis is going to be a municipality. So, sorry, this map is not the one I wanted to show you. So you should ignore this eastern region here, because we're going to rely on France's 1914 borders, which doesn't include this eastern region. But so we're going to have data at the municipal level. So we got around 35,000 municipalities. And this is what it looks like, so if we plot the, log collaborators per capita at the municipal level, and this is going to be the basis of our analysis. So we're going to match these two data on the Verdun rotation, and in particular, what municipality served under Pétain in the Battle of Verdun. So to do this, we focus on the line infantry. So there is 173 line infantry regiments at the start of the war. As I said, every man, sorry, I said between 18 and 40, it's between 20 and 48 was mobilized for the First World War. And military recruitment for the infantry was local. So all the men of the specific municipalities would go to the same regiment in 80% of the cases. Sometimes there would be more than one regiment. So you could go to one of two regiments for the really well-populated municipalities. But in general, one municipality, one regiment. And what we did is that we built a new data set allocating each 1914 French municipality to its infantry regiment. And to do this, we had to consult books that just tell us, what municipality belongs to what military recruitment bureau. And then from that, we know what regiment was allocated to this recruitment bureau. So we digitize all this data. And then from this, we can know which municipality. So we have 35,000 municipalities allocated to each possible infantry regiment. And then we build the battle history of each regiment. And for this, we just read the diaries of these regiments. So we went to each of the 173 historical records of each regiment to reconstruct its battle history. And in particular, we determined whether each regiment fought at Verdun or not, and if so, whether it fought under Pétain or not. So as I told you, 90% of the line infantry is rotated through Verdun between February and December 1916. But Pétain is only there between February and May. And so that means that 50% of the line infantry is under direct command of Pétain, and the other is not. And to reconstruct the battle history, we just read those books. So I, in particular, read them many times to code which battle each regiment went to.
Sorry, just a quick question. That 50% is 50% of the 89 or 50% of the total regiment?
I think it's 50% of the total regiment. Yeah, so it's, well, yeah. No, it's 50% of the ones who went to Verdun.
Okay.
I think so. I don't, yeah. But it doesn't make much of a difference. So in terms of, I'll show you the map. So this is the map of France in 1914. So we don't have these eastern regions that were German at the time, because Germany had, had seized those territories in 1870. And this is in the end what we end up with. So, all the one with the vertical or horizontal would have gone to Verdun under Pétain, and the one diagonals would not have served at Verdun. Well, would have served at Verdun, but not under Pétain. And the white ones are the ones who didn't serve at Verdun at all. And that's because they were kept. So some of them were, with the Australians in Gallipoli, having a good time, actually. So the French in the Dardanelles have actually much lower death rates than the rest of the French regiments. They were not exactly with the Australians. They were a bit further, and actually it wasn't nearly as bad where the French were on the Southeastern Front compared to where you guys were. So some of these regiments are in Salonika or in the Dardanelles. there is one infantry regiment that's in a prisoner of camp, in a prisoner of war camp in Germany, and some were kept in reserve for the Somme offensive. So there are very few municipalities that are not rotated at Verdun. So we're really going to use whether you're under Pétain or not, conditional on going to Verdun. And actually, if we exclude those who didn't go to Verdun, their results are actually even more precise and larger in magnitude. And Verdun, to give you an idea, is this red diamond here, really in the east. So our empirical strategy is going to be to regress the local share of collaborators in municipality I on whether the regiment was rotated at Verdun under Pétain, conditional on whether you went to Verdun. So here I'm saying the share of local regiments because, so see, like here I've got vertical lines and horizontal lines. Verticals is when I have one municipality, one regiment, and this regiment was rotated at Verdun under Pétain. And the horizontal ones is those municipalities that are allocated to more than one regiment, and at least part of that, at least one of those regiments is rotated at Verdun under Pétain. So this, if you want, is not a dummy, it's the share of the local regiments that is rotated at Verdun under Pétain, but it doesn't really change much. We're going to cluster standard errors at the regiment level because this is where our treatment is defined, and we've got 173. And when we're going to control for municipalities' characteristics, and in particular, vote in 1914, in the last pre-World War I election, population in 1911, and in some specification, World War I death rates, and additional controls for what happened in World War II. But our preferred specification is to just have pre-World War I stuff. So like vote in 1914 and population 1911, and then we're going to have department fixed effect. So we're going to have fixed effect for the second smallest district in the French census, which is department. So these are the blue lines, and we're going to use within department variation in whether you were rotated at Verdun under Pétain, conditional on being rotated at Verdun. So it's very local variation. And as you see, like the variation, we don't have variation for every department. So the identification,
Pauline, can I ask a quick question about the specification that you showed? Just for clarification, there was an interaction in there. So the Verdun under Pétain is an interaction of two, a share and a dummy, right?
No, none of this is a dummy.
So one is a share.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Whether you serve at the beginning, yeah.
Right. So I mean, I'm just trying to understand, where is the Pétain dummy by itself, the independent effect of that dummy? Is it captured somewhere? Or?
So you don't have you don't have an independent effect. Like it's just like whether you serve under him at Verdun or not. I'm going to show you another specification where we also control for serving for Pétain at other parts of the war, in particular before, because he's just promoted up, right? So like after that, he's in command of a lot, but I'm going to show you what happens to the regiments that serve for him outside Verdun. And yeah.
I got a quick question about that too. Sorry, Pauline. So World War II combat intensity, does it mean how much combat they faced while they were at Verdun? Because
no, that's World War II.
Because the treatment at the moment is Pétain, but surely specific times at Verdun were different. I mean, even in those few months, I'm sure there were some weeks that were horrible and others also horrible, but not nearly as much. So I wonder whether, the treatment you pick up, you want to assign it to Pétain, but there might be a lot of other things that would have happened in that particular time. And I think my guess is that time period is very well documented. So hopefully you could control for, how much shelling they faced and how many artillery attacks, et cetera, that you could then potentially filter out, and it's not, and then get closer to actually a Pétain effect.
So I'm going to talk about that. So I don't think there is actually very good data on like shells at the day level, and I think there are estimates on like how many shells fell in total over the whole battle, but I don't think that would be much more precise thing. But what I'm going to show you is that in terms of death rates, for example, it's balanced for those who were, you know, at Verdun, the Pétain and others. So there is no higher death rates for the Battle of Verdun in general and for the Battle of like Verdun under Pétain. Then in terms of like specific time period, I'm going to show you that, you know, because one thing is that Pétain is there for, you know, March and April and a bit of February. So that's 2 months. And I'm comparing this to 8 months. So I'm going to show you what happens when I compare it to any other 2 months or any other 3 months, because it's like 2 and a bit months. And then, you know, we know things like, I know because we have the individual level data on deaths during the First World War, and I have the date of death of these soldiers. So I know how many soldiers died on a specific day. And we can control for that. It doesn't really change anything, which is not super surprising because it's actually quite balanced.
Do you know whether they died of an attack or were they attacking, or any more detail, or just how many died?
No, I know, you know, what day they died.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's actually, yeah, I'll show you in a few slides. So the identification assumption, in fact, here is like the timing of the rotation at Verdun is uncorrelated with the propensity of a municipality to support Vichy and the German occupation later on.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, just back into that specification. So, oops, back to the specification, please. I mean, basically this, this Verdun, basically this Pétain Verdun is that means the type of rotation of the troops on the front line, right? So, for example, if Pétain was doing the right thing, I mean, why the troops not under Pétain would not do the same type of strategy?
So in fact, you know, so this no real rotation, it stays even after Pétain leaves. So there is no major strategic change after he leaves. So
no,
is that what you're
between being under Pétain, not under Pétain? It's just the leadership, Pétain leadership?
That's right. Yeah, so that's the idea, is that the guys who fought under Pétain are gonna have two things. They're gonna have a specific link to him, but they're gonna also have these shared heroic credentials of having saved France, you know, at this specific battle under this specific guy. Because what I'm gonna show you is that there is no effect of Verdun on its own, and there's no effect of Pétain on its own. So having served for Pétain before, you don't really see an effect. So it's really this idea of complementarity between, you know, the heroic status of the leader and your heroic status as the soldier who served under him, and your specific attachment to this leader. And then the fact that, you know, being a hero, you're going to be more able to convince those around you. So I'm going to show you that you know, it diffuses through other demographics in those municipalities.
So Pétain actually left. Sorry.
Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah. So Pétain actually left before the end of the war at Verdun.
Sorry?
So Pétain actually left that position before the end of that Verdun war?
Yeah. Well, he was promoted up, if you want.
He was promoted out. Okay.
Yeah. Because
so related to that, I mean, to some extent, the war that was happening in Verdun under Pétain was different from the war that happened before, because that's, you know, you said that, you know, a lot of military leaders were sacked because of their ineptness. And it also changed after Pétain left or was promoted, right? So, I mean, yes, I agree that there is a personal connection to Pétain here for all the soldiers who served, but it's also that they witnessed a different war.
So not really. So I don't think that the Battle of Verdun itself changed drastically the day he leaves. Like all the innovation that he put in place, they're still there. So like the rotation system that he had put in place is the same one that is kept until the end of the battle. What changes is that the commanding general is different. And in particular, you know, there are two other generals that take charge of the battle, and they're not as popular, and they don't care about who dies, and they never go in the front line with the infantry. And yeah, so
but I agree with you on that. The technology might not have changed, but the intensity of the war must have for it to warrant political promotion of Pétain.
So
right?
he's promoted because he's already lionized as the hero of Verdun, and politicians kind of become afraid of his popularity.
So the
and they want to
popularity
demote him. Sorry?
So the popularity stems from him doing a good job, right?
That's right.
So when he has done a good job, obviously that is evaluated by how the war is faring. So the war is changing.
Yes. So
France...
can I show you the balance?
All right, sorry.
Like,
let's
I'll
keep
show
going.
you what happens to the death rates, like under him and not under him. Okay, so regarding the timing, so we want the timing to be exogenous, okay? And so I'm just going to show you visually what regiments are present in Verdun for each month. And by the way, Michael, I don't have more detail level than the month. It would be very difficult to consistently code like week by week. So they said so it's kind of so this is February, so that gives you also an idea of the size of a regiment. So when we cluster standard errors, so each dot is like its pattern of color is a regiment, and then the light blue is like part of the regiment of the municipality are there, and the dark blue is this one municipality, one regiment, and it's there. So this is in February, March, April, and then at the 1st of May, Pétain is promoted away from command. June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So you see that there is this rotation of troops from all through France, but I'm going to present to you more formal test of balance to check that municipalities that are rotated under command of Pétain are similar to the ones that are not. So first thing we do is that we collect data on pre-World War I political vote at the municipal level. So this is hand collected from the paper archives on the 1914 legislative election. We have the 1911 census of the municipality. We have other previous census on religion, occupation, literacy, gender, nationality. We know what's in the soil. We know the weather. We know, but importantly, we have data on these 1.2 million military fatalities, and we know. So we know their date of birth, we know their municipality of birth for 99% of them, and we know when they died. So this is to show you balance. So this is, with department fixed effects, or this is with nothing. Left vote share for the center, for the right, turnout in 1914. You can see that these things are balanced and the p-values are enormous, right? So this is really, really super well balanced. Log population in 1936, what happens in World War II, combat days, log distance demarcation line, all of this is super balanced. This is election results for 1914, party by party. There's nothing for these Verdun under Pétain municipalities. Then this is the 1872 census. It's pretty much balanced everywhere, except for a couple of things, but by this time we've run 200 regressions. This is, department fixed effect, precipitation, what's in the soil, super detailed stuff, and there's nothing different in those municipalities. So this is the thing that we were talking about, the death rate in line infantry regiments and the overall death rates in municipalities. So this is at the regiment level, column 1 and 2, at the municipal level, column 3 and 4. And I'm regressing here the death rates on the battle rotation. So this is, by regiment, and this is whether you serve at the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. This is whether you serve Verdun under Pétain, Verdun, the Somme battle, Chemin des Dames, or the Southeastern Front. So as you can see, Verdun itself is depending, it's not even such a disastrous battle compared to others. Verdun under Pétain is never significant in terms of death rates. So you can see that some other battles were really bad. So the Somme and the Chemin des Dames. And as I was telling the guys in the Dardanelles, close to the Australians, the French people were in a better sector of the Southeastern Front because they actually have lower death rates. And at the municipal level, this is the only significant difference is that the guys who were at the Southeastern Front have lower death rates, but all the regiments on the Western Front at the municipal level, you don't see any significant differences in death rates. And that's consistent with the philosophy of the French army that wanted each regiment to be interchangeable. So it was, by design, they wanted to maintain sort of equality of death rates. And this is very different from the German army, right? So the German army, you have this very specialized local regiments. The French are not like that. Like each regiment is supposed to be interchangeable.
Isn't it the case that you say part of the reason they treat him like hero is they care about the soldiers, they care about their lives. So that's a big,
yeah.
So isn't that supposed to imply the interaction with Pétain supposed to have a negative effect on the mortality?
So so this is tricky. I mean, already there's been a couple of questions like this, right? So he's trying to be more economical with lives, but he's facing slightly different battle conditions, right? I'm not saying that every day of the battle is the same. And in particular, after the Somme offensive in the summer, like the Germans are not so active in Verdun anymore.
Right. So but then that would probably tell me one mechanism about this heroism thing. Like it's not operated through that the mortality has been reduced. It's something else.
Yeah, and also remember these regiments, they're supposed to be interchangeable. So the high command is taking all the decisions about the rotation of these regiments. So he's actually, they actually might remove them from Verdun if they are too decimated. They might remove them away from the Verdun front, and put them in a more easy part of the front to sort of spare them, right? So there is like all these strategic decisions going on at the same time as well. So these regiments they're rotated by French high command. So Pétain it's not Pétain decided which regiment to rotate. He's basically dealing with what he's given. Okay, so
sorry,
yeah.
I have a question. So does it mean that the way in which the regiments are shifted or move into and out of Verdun depends on the quality or the, I don't know how to put it, their fighting abilities of the soldiers that belong to each regiment?
Fighting abilities?
I mean, you just said that the high command could take someone out of a regiment out of Verdun if they are being decimated by the Germans. Does it mean that this rotation depends on unobservables from that specific regiment?
Well, what kind of unobservables?
example,
not precipitation, not coal, not silver, not vote, not Catholic places of worship, not religion, not share of men. It's just like, I mean, I don't know what else to show you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. My point is maybe if you could take the regiment that were split between Pétain and the other generals, maybe you could just pick up the moment in which they decided that, okay, this guy is a real hero and he is saving us from dying there. You know what I mean?
Not really. I'm gonna let me show you some results, because I think I'm gonna address some of this stuff in the mechanisms. But first of all, I just want to show you the main results. So this is the map that I showed you about which regiment was rotated at Verdun and Pétain. So this is like the horizontal one or vertical ones are the ones rotated under Pétain. And if we project the map of collaboration, we see that, raw statistics actually indicate that there is 26% more collaborators per capita in Verdun under Pétain municipalities without controlling for anything else. So now we estimate the specification that I showed you before with department fixed effect that take into account of a lot of unobservable heterogeneity at the department level. And what we observe is that Verdun is nothing, but Verdun under Pétain, we see that there is around 8.5% more collaborators in those municipalities, and that's controlling, here there's no control, here are control for vote in 1914, population in 1911, World War I fatality rate. So you see this coefficient associated with World War I fatality rate, again, is like, it's not even driving collaboration, but we know that it's balanced anyway, so the coefficient doesn't change. So, if you're worried about influence of unobservable, you actually see that compare column 1 to column, like our preferred specification is column 3, with like pre-World War I stuff, the coefficient actually goes up. So that's, standard tests would suggest that if you add more unobservable, then your coefficient would be even more precise and large. So we know a standard test about unobservable suggests that it's really working in our favor. It's robust to alternative specification forms. So instead of using log, we can use the inverse hyperbolic sign, or we can use the Poisson specification. It's robust to that. And if you're worried about, this spatial standard errors of persistence, we can compute, more on statistics and p-values that suggest that spatial autocorrelation of error terms is really not a concern here. I can also show you the results of a spatial regression discontinuity design. So, really zooming in on the borders of these areas within departments. And what we see is that the share of collaborators jumps by 11% on the treated side of the border. But again, if we look at other covariates, we see no discontinuity. So this result is super robust. I had a question before about the quality of the data on collaboration that we use. So for sure, what we have is the most representative and comprehensive data source on collaboration in France that exists. People may be worried about it, so we use two other sources of data, which are completely marginal compared to what we have. So there is a data collected by the United States Office for Strategic Services in 1944 on high-end collaborators. And there is also data, sorry, this is a mistake. There is an extra 3 here. So on 9,000 members, volunteers for the Legion of Volunteers Against Bolshevism. So these are volunteers who went to fight under Wehrmacht uniform on the Eastern Front. And one difference with that list and what we have is that it also includes data on volunteers who were not accepted, and also data who on the one who died on the front, because it's really the listing of people who volunteered for it. And we can use the same specification with this alternative source of data, and we get the same result, even though they're super small and specific data sets compared to what we have. And the fact that we obtain similar results is actually consistent with the fact that in our data, we observe the same magnitude of results when we look at different kind of collaboration. So in terms of mechanisms, I think, so I'm going to show you that the effects of Pétain's leadership and the networks of heroes are complements. So I've already told you this. So there is no effect of Verdun outside of Pétain. I already had a question about Pétain before Verdun, and I'm going to show you that there is no result. And I'm going to also show you the result for those who were exposed to another major commander, which is Ferdinand Foch, or another heroic battle, which is the Battle of the Marne in 1914. And all of this, there is no effect for any of this. And so the effect is really specific to Pétain at Verdun. So then in terms of channel, I think you've already alluded to this, maybe is the effect of violence and, some things that I don't observe about the differences in the battle conditions in March versus, June, which is possible, but I'm going to show you a wealth of evidence that that suggests that that's not driving the results. So you can ask a very quick question. Yeah.
Sorry. So when you say the effect is not there if somebody served under Pétain at a different place, but wouldn't in retrospect, if Pétain came this hero, especially after the war, wouldn't you think then
so
have the same identification, even though they served with him at a different place, not Verdun?
Yeah, so I think what's essential for our result is not so much how you as a soldier is treated by Pétain. So I think that effect is there. So the effect is positive, but it's not significant because I think it's specific to the soldier. So I think, if they serve for Pétain before, they're loyal to him, but because they don't have themselves the heroic status of Verdun veterans, how much they're able to convince those around them is not there. So I think there is not only Pétain in 1940, you don't question him because he's such a hero. If he says something, it means that it's the right thing. But the heroic Verdun veterans themselves is the same thing. If they say something, they must be right. Whereas some guy who served for Pétain but didn't go to Verdun doesn't have the same status in his local municipalities that enables him to convince those around him.
But that person may have been at Verdun too, but just hadn't had the chance to serve under Pétain there. It served under Pétain somewhere else.
Well, but it's all controlled for in a regression, right? So I'll show you the results. So this is, there is like Verdun and then Pétain before Verdun. So this is the guys who served Pétain before Verdun, but then are shipped to Salonika in 1916. You see what I mean?
Yeah. I still think I'm more concerned about that in terms of that in retrospect. But yeah, sorry, I'll keep about
as you see, like, so this effect is positive, but it's not significant. So I think they themselves, they're treated.
It's not positive. I mean, this is far away from any significance. It's zero.
No, but sure, but it's not, but so it's this. So, the scale of the results that we find, it's 7 to 10% of the municipality, like it's a huge number, right? So it's not just circumscribed to the veterans themselves. So I think I'm running out of time anyway. So maybe I'll run through those results. And then I'll come back. So this is the effect of the coefficient for different demographics. So these are males. So these are the males, World War I veteran age. So you see that the effects are stronger for these guys and the guys who are just too young to serve in the First World War, but are children in the First World War. So you see that for sure the effects are stronger for these two demographics, but they're also there for others. And in particular, they are there for women as well. And this can only be explained for, and maybe we should do this graph in the municipalities that, this Pétain before Verdun, and maybe you would see this effect here, but it would be so small that it can't, drive an average result if you want. So there is this idea that you have this diffusion through local networks because the heroic veterans of Verdun themselves are unquestionable. And so there's this idea that you have this diffusion through their local networks because they become the trusted source. So they're treated by Pétain and they're loyal to him, and their position becomes also unquestionable at the local level. If you want the same dynamic that plays at these two different levels, which explains the scale of the results that we find and explains why those treated before do not get this. Okay, so we look at differences in war experience. So we touched across this already. So, we control for World War I fatality rate. There's no effect. It was balanced anyway. World War II, there's nothing to. And then we also look at whether it's robust to controlling for participation in other battles in or before 1916. And also, this idea that you have these 2 months and maybe, I'm comparing 2 months to 8 months. So here I'm comparing 2 months to other group of 2 months or to group of 3 months. And you can see that we only see this effect for these guys. And then, like this is randomization in France that shows you that, our estimated effects are well outside the range of what we obtain from these tests. So, this really brings the question of like why these people would collaborate. So is it, maybe other possibilities are include pecuniary benefits or psychological effects of violence, right? So I'm telling you that the World War I death rate is not dissimilar, but maybe it's other characteristics that I'm not measuring. So the mechanism, if that was true, is that it's really have to do with the battle experience during World War I. And that would be specific to the veterans themselves, right? So how much shelling they experience on a day versus another day, that would affect only the veterans themselves. And how that would affect them is maybe through like tolerance for risk or psychological cost of violence. So if that was true, maybe we would observe a larger propensity to participate in paramilitary organization or direct Nazi collaboration compared to, joining a political fascist party or doing economic collaboration. But this is not what we're seeing, right? So we're seeing effects that are consistent across different types of collaboration. So it's not pecuniary incentives, and it's not really some psychological effects that is limited to the veterans themselves. And I think it's important, like, the scale of the result that we're talking about and the nature is not, it's important that it's not circumscribed to the veterans. I'm not telling you a story of a veteran, goes and fights for him and he's treated by the leader and that changes his view. He changes his view, but because of his own status within the local community, he's able to convince those around them. And yeah, so it's this idea that these local heroes, they follow their leader, but they're also able to sway those around them. So we've got additional results that show you that it's really that, well, yeah, so again, if it was really things that happen on the battleground, another possible story would be like collective action. So, you experience conflict and you're more likely to do something during World War II. So is it true that these people are more likely to join the resistance? For example, we find the opposite effect. So there is 8% fewer members of the internal resistance in those municipalities, which is consistent with this, realignment of value with Pétain's own values. Then we can find some evidence that it's consistent with internalized values that depends on the locality where you grew up. So to do this, we can look at movers and see what matters. Is it the municipality of birth that matters or the municipality of residence? And we find that, both matters. But the fact that the treatment status of your birth municipality matters shows that at least part of the effect is played by these internalized values. And by the way, like the effect when we exclude movers is closer to 10% rather than 8.5%. So it's consistent with the fact that, moving dilutes the effect. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to show you is effect on political preferences in those municipalities that starts even before World War II. So during the interwar, Pétain doesn't have a formal political role, but his values are known. Okay, so he's an advocate of like family, army, country. He's contemptuous of parliamentary democracy. He's very popular, and he's a fervent anti-communist. And there is also during the interwar active World War I veteran organizations. Some of them are quite violent and right-wing. So here the idea is that if the effect of exposure to Pétain was really channeled through political preferences, considering that it's well known during the interwar that this guy is a fervent anti-communist, a right-wing conservative, we should expect a decrease in the share of vote for the left and an increase in the share of vote for the right during the interwar. And remember that in 1914, there is no difference. So we hand collected data for 24, 32, 36 legislative elections. Since I wrote this slide, we also collected data for 1919. And we look at what happened during the interwar. So whatever, this is maps, but I'm going to show you the results. So this is like a pooled cross-section with your fixed effects, pre-World War I vote share and 1911 population. And this is the vote share in these municipalities for the extreme left, center right, right, and extreme right. And so what you see is that you see this very large increase, and the extreme right is only running in 1919 and 1936. In the other elections, there is no extreme right candidates. So what you see is that in those municipalities, you see that there is a realignment of political values towards the right in the interwar. And if you look at election by election, what happens is that you see a decrease in the share of vote for communists as soon as the 1924 elections, and then an increase for not really pro-parliamentary democracy conservative parties, and then the fascist leagues in 1936. So I don't think I've got the election results election by elections here, but yeah, we have them in the paper. So we also look at, hang on, did I have? Yeah. So we also look at post-World War II elections. So these results here, they're at the municipal level. So we've got this, it's very like clean if you want, because it's the same. We've got this data at the municipal election. For post-World War II, we only have it at the electoral district level. But we have the results for 18 post-World War II legislative elections. And then we can again look at what happened in these Verdun and the Pétain municipalities. And what we see is that there is this lower vote share for the left and higher vote share for the, sorry, my table is cut. Sorry, this is terrible formatting. I was actually, rerunning the slides just before the presentation. But so what you can see is that, there is a 6.6 percentage point decline of the, my God. Anyway, forget it. I'm just going to show you election by election because the headings are all screwed up. So this is each election between 46 and 2017. And what you see is that there is this steady lower vote share for the left. So on average, this coefficient is right, it's 6.6% lower, like across all these elections. And then for the right, you see these big spikes in specific years, which are 58, 68, and 1981. So in 58, this is the context of the Algerian War, where de Gaulle had fled to Germany because there was the threat of a coup by the army. In 68, this was like massive political and social unrest with big strikes. In 1981 is the election of the first socialist president of the post-war era in France. And this guy had a joint program with the communists. And the right was, saying that the Russian tanks would be in Paris and every rich person in France took its money to Switzerland. And so like people were really scared. So what you see is that you've got this increase in the share of vote, this steady decrease in the share of vote for the left, and then these spikes in vote share for the right in times of social and political crisis. So we argue that there is this, this return to authoritarianism where people feel threatened, such as they did in 58, 68, and 1981. And, for German people in the audience, it may seem weird that we find this super big post-war effect. But, so one thing I want to say is that, and I actually had this graph somewhere in the presentation, maybe. Do I have them? It's like in France, it's totally acceptable to call your son Philippe. So this is, what happened to the share of little baby boy called Philippe. So it spikes, when Pétain is in power. But then when Pétain dies, it spikes big time because he's such a hero and, people still love him. This is what happened. So, people call their son Philippe when he's in power and then it goes down a bit because, and then Pétain dies of his natural death because de Gaulle commutes his death sentence. So he dies of a natural death. And this is the explosion of this guy called Philippe. And this is a daily Boston Globe article talking about clashes throughout France, violent demonstration of veterans in support of Pétain in 1951 when he dies. And I think that's important to remember, to understand, because I don't think that Mussolini or Hitler have the same kind of post-war aura that Pétain still has in France. Anyway, so to conclude, so we highlight the role of personal ties to leaders and political action and preferences, but we highlight not only the role of these personal ties, but the credentials that heroism also confers to these normal individuals in convincing those around them. So, if you want, leveraging their ties to Pétain in convincing those around them. So I think this complementarity in the network also explains some of the weirdest, results maybe that we have in the data. Not only that they collaborated with Germany, even though, Pétain and these veterans were, had fought against him, but we also, so we don't know what dates people collaborate in our data set, but we know what dates some of these organizations are created. So the milice in particular is only created in 1943. So, and this Legion of French Volunteer Against Bolshevism, that's like 1944. So at this point, it's very clear that Germany is losing the war. So, why do people take this extreme decision so late in the conflict? We argue in the paper, explained by this idea of escalating commitments in networks where your own worth is tied to the worth of the national hero. So the day, he's recognized as a traitor, your own identity is also shattered, and that can explain some of the dynamics in these results. So we argue that heroism imbues greater trust and credibility, not only in leaders but also for those who share those credentials, and can also act as a relevant signal for delegation of authority and decision making, and in terms of external validity, we have this quote in the paper of Abraham Lincoln, who writes to Joseph Hooker, what I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. But because he was not successful, he didn't have to risk the dictatorship. And that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, I think so we're good timing, but I'm sure there are questions waiting in line. So Pauline, do you mind waiting for staying a bit longer?
Sure.
Answer some questions?
No problem.
Okay, so if you're in a hurry and you need to go, that's fine. I'm gonna conclude officially right now, but if you have questions, you want to stay, feel free to stay.
Sure, no problem.
Questions? Anyone?
I have a question, more than a question, I have an idea. You mentioned that before he got the commanding lead of the battle, there were a series of generals that were doing a bad job, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could leverage the fact that some regiments were exposed to both a losing general in quotes and a winning general to see if they have a higher effect. If you find a higher effect for those regiments that were exposed to both, because they would be the ones that would see Pétain as a real hero. At least in my mind. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, so it's so there is no regiment. So all the regiments that are, so it's 5 days, right? So the battle starts on the 21st of February. He takes command on the 26th of February, and no regiment is pulled out at that point. So we don't have variation like in those. But you would have regiments that, that arrive in March versus being there in February. Honestly, like if we do the results month by month, so like we exclude those who were there in February, then in March, then in April, we don't see drastically different results. I mean, I think I remember, I don't know, I think I did this regression last week and nothing really jumped to my eyes.
Okay, Tusha?
Well, thank you, Pauline. And I first want to say that this is amazing work. So thank you for that. And any comments that I have, any skepticism is just because I'm curious. But here are a few concerns that I've been thinking of. I mean, I'm first of all worried that there is selection both into serving at Verdun, which Juan pointed out, and not serving, and serving under Pétain. One possibility is that, as you said, that they wanted to equalize somehow the casualty rate across different regiments. So if there is a particular regiment that is already decimated because of the first German offense, then they might not get a chance to serve because they're quite decimated. So that's that. But also in terms of the mechanism that you had in mind about the heroism, I'm concerned because it could be that I have served under a successful military tactician, and I trust the tactician to have some private information about the ongoing war that I might not have, right? And that's why perhaps even when Germany is looking to fail for sure, I still trust the tactician, right? And the third was, I mean, to what extent is it about heroes versus is it about, as you showed towards the end of your presentation, that my political preferences have changed, and we know they change during war times anyway. So it has nothing to do with the Verdun or Pétain in particular, but it has more to do with it's wartime. We need a tactician and not a left-leaning, well, for the lack of a better word, ideologue.
Why is the left-leaning an ideologue and not the right-wing fascist here?
Well, I don't.
It's just, obviously some political propaganda is very effective on you.
I would disagree.
Anyway, no, it's not a personal attack. It's just.
No, definitely not. I understand, but I would disagree. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay, so selection at Verdun, you mean like, so one thing that we can do, so I think what's not the same is the municipalities that don't serve at Verdun. So you can actually, exclude those from the sample and just have the sample of those who fought at Verdun. And the results are larger and more precisely estimated. And then within Verdun, in terms of selection of like who serves under Pétain or not, I mean, honestly, I don't know what more to do than show like balance on every possible characteristics and, show that the coefficient actually goes up when you add control. Like, it's just, you have to tell me the story of the unobservable. You
Sure,
can't just say there's selection, like, you've got to come up with a story and then.
Yeah. So one test that you showed, so most of your tests were for like characteristics pre-war, right? And so what I'm worried about, and Juan was also worried about, was characteristics of the process during the war at Verdun, under Pétain. And the death rates matching is not a great test, because a good journal at a bad war will have lower death rates than a bad journal at a mild war, right?
Okay, so but I think this would have implication. So that's entirely possible. I agree with you, but I think this would have implications for the mechanism, right? So I think that would be something, first of all, that will only affect the veterans themselves. And I think, so I know that there is a large literature on like the effect of conflict itself, and it affects your tolerance for risk and your capacity for collective action and all of these things. And so I think that if it was really, this effect would be circumscribed to the veterans, and it would, I think, drive more violent paramilitary organization rather than any kind of collaboration, whether you're more likely to, engage in economic collaboration or not.
I come from a military family, and I would disagree that soldiers know best what war can do to people, and they want to avoid war at all costs. So I think they would actually go for more formal or more non-violent kind of collaboration later on.
Okay,
but that's just something.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So maybe, but this is not what we observe, right? So so it's very consistent across all these different things. And we even have like party. There is a political party who's called like the Friends of the Marshal. Is just like this, and we even have very intellectual organizations, and the effects are consistent across all of these different organizations. So I think what you say maybe is true and maybe plays at the margin for some of the veterans, but I don't think that this is what's driving the results.
Thank you.
And also in terms of political preferences, so I think it's, what I didn't say maybe in the presentation, but in this context, like everybody is treated, right? So it's not like I'm not comparing a village that was more affected by a conflict to a village that is less affected by the conflict. It's like everybody's affected. And also Pétain is a national hero. So anything that I'm talking about is a wide underestimate of the effect of Pétain on collaboration in total, right? So, and this we cannot estimate, but I think, historians are very clear that everybody was behind him. And I think what you say is, you trust the tactician. It's exactly that. It's just, this guy is such a hero and he's so good and he knows what's good and it's unquestionable. And everybody was thinking that. What we show is that there is this additional marginal effect in these towns that directly served under him. But, we don't have the counterfactual of not being treated by him at all. So I think this is, it's important to remember that this is a really wide underestimate of the effect of him in general.
All right, Michael or Rafat? Rafat, did you?
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so this is for my own understanding. So is it common knowledge that who served under Pétain in Verdun and who did not? Like ordinary people know that, because that would change the influence of the veterans on the population?
So I don't think it's something that's written on someone's head, like when they travel around France, but within those local towns, they know, right? So it's common not, I mean, the soldiers themselves know. And when they come back from the conflict, they say, I was at Verdun for this guy, and, trust me, this guy is really the best. And, I was at Verdun myself, and that has a huge implication for the way these veterans were treated or not. So, there's a historian who wrote in France that, who didn't do Verdun didn't do the war. But then if you did Verdun in addition under Pétain, you have this additional, effect, if you want. So and that's known in the local village.
Okay. And also, are we assuming that the other veterans, those who did not serve under Pétain, they are also trying to convince people, but their ability is not as, like, they don't have as much ability because they did not serve directly under Pétain?
No. I think they have, so all the Verdun veterans have the same credibility, but the ones who didn't serve directly under him don't have the same political preferences.
Okay, so it's about their preferences. I thought it's about their like heroic, like people don't consider them as much of a hero as.
Yeah, so it's really the complementarity. So I think people who didn't do Verdun, for sure, I don't think that they're considered as much as heroes as the people who did Verdun. But I don't think that the people who did Verdun under Pétain are, necessarily more or less heroic than the people who did just, maybe if you were there in December, you were a bit less heroic than if you were there at the beginning. But as I showed you, we don't, like, when we look at these 3 months, it doesn't really matter. I think so. Is these 2 things, it's just like the ability, like the credit that they have in their local communities, plus the fact that for some of them, they are completely loyal to Pétain. And, they would come back in their village and talk to their son and say, the only reason that you're alive is thanks to Pétain. And these narratives, they're there, right? So maybe we should do a better job at like finding, narratives. For sure, for someone growing up in France, it's very obvious, like, but yeah, and I think this is also why it's still acceptable to call your kid Philippe. I mean, you don't have kids called Adolf in Germany after Second World War, and in France it's like fine, and you still have, like, I still have these people who are like my friend, and they're like, oh no, but Pétain, he was such a good guy, he did good things. It's just like it's completely crazy.
Right. So is it possible that it was easier for Pétain to mobilize people who directly served under him to invest more in them, and then that played out as? So
again, that's a possibility, which I think is inconsistent with the results. So, one thing is that you would imagine that he would still have those ties with these people, and they could derive higher pecuniary benefits from collaboration, for example. But again, you would maybe accept more collaboration. So I think in terms of, we're really looking at tiny little town within local district. Like I don't think there is any ties between Pétain and these millions of people, right? I mean, we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of people. It's just, I don't think it's believable that he maintained those networks, and I don't think that he was really thinking that he was going to access power one day. So I don't think that game was played. I think maybe what was happening is that you had these veteran organizations that were set up by people close to Pétain, and maybe you had these things, but in big cities maybe, but not at the level of these tiny villages that we look at consistently.
Right, thank you.
All right, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, great talk. Thank you very much. Learned a lot. One question, not to challenge the results, but in terms of channel mechanism, I'm thinking about why and who served under Pétain would be most his strongest advocate. Would it be the ones who got protected by him, who maybe he protected them from a German offense? And I think that data you should get on a very detailed level. Do the deaths come from German offenses, or does a French general go there and say, hey, now we're going to attack the Germans? Because you might pick up the same deaths, but it's a big difference, going back to what Tushar said, if my general is leading me into an offensive, or if he's protecting me from an offensive of the opponent. And I wonder whether you could somehow delineate that and not just say serving under Pétain in Verdun, but serving under Pétain, let's say regime 1, where there was offensives by the German, and then say regime 2, Pétain in Verdun, but serving under a stalemate or actually an attack by the French or something like that. Like one thing I'm a bit, and I know you may not have that data, but it would be great to have more information on what actually happened in those in those time periods in terms of not only deaths, but also which movements, who was attacking, who wasn't, what else happened in terms of negotiations and so on. Because I think that might, if you see the effect to be consistent, that would be interesting. But if you delineate between, let's say, two different regimes there, even if they might be very general, and you see that especially the ones where the soldiers got protected from German offensive by Pétain, they would be the most strongest advocates for him. I think that would tell you a little bit more about the mechanism, what happens. But I could be wrong in terms of the data, you may not be able to do it. So
I think in terms of data, so again, our data is at the regiment level. And yeah, it's not so clear. And sorry.
But these served first 2 weeks of February and then second 2 weeks of February.
For some, for some, the diaries are just like, we're in the inferno of Verdun all March. And then in some, it's just like, we're there from the 11th to the 22nd. So we cannot code consistently at a more precise level than the month across all the regiments. So for some regiments, we know, because it's just like these diaries, some of them are more precise than others.
But the rotational maps you showed, my understanding was that, soldiers from that region would have served in that time period. Did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, but at the month level. And what I'm saying is that it's very... So we tried several dimensions of potential heterogeneity, and we didn't find that much. So, across months, or even if they're at Verdun for longer than others, or if we can interact with the number of deaths in that regiment during that period. And the results are, I don't know. It's just, I think in terms of statistical power, we're a bit short.
One thing you could do, I think, is look at not just deaths, but deaths that are more likely to be induced by German offensives or by French offensives. Because I know they went, obviously the Germans attacked most of the time, but then the French attacked back, and then they went back and forth at different times. Yeah. Death is not the same as a death. Going back to what Tushar said, if I was a soldier and my general leads me to an offensive, I wouldn't be very happy. But if he manages to protect me from an offensive, more so than another general could have, I'd be really happy.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I think it's tricky, right? Because these guys are in the front for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. So, and according to the theory of this rotation system, they're in the front, they're in the first line for 2 weeks. They're in the second line and then the third line. It's not so much that they're only there for 2 weeks.
But you can
my own reading
major offenses. That's what you can do.
So my own reading, you're talking as if you're talking about something like the first day of the Somme. It's like this massive offensive. Honestly, what happens at Verdun during these 10 months is a bloody mess. It's just like, at this sector on that day, there is an offense, and then there is a defense, and then they're moving. It's just like, it's such a mess that maybe, I don't know, maybe it would be possible to do more. I think it's possible, but I think it would be very difficult to do this consistently for all the regiments.
Or if you just have a rough distinction, but if you said you've done heterogeneity tests, then and there's not much, okay. But that's one thing I would have liked to see a bit more, just more information rather than deaths. And again, I understand it's hard to come by. And anyways.
Yeah, And the problem as well is that, honestly, for some regiments, we would know what sector of the front they're at. And for other, not. So, Verdun is a big sector of the front. So, you would have guys in Vaud and guys in Douaumont, and their circumstances would be different. But again, the data that we've come across, it's very difficult to do this. Yeah, precisely.
Okay. Another question, is the rotation actually, is it perfectly random? Like every new period you get it gets scrambled, or do I know, oh, these 2 weeks I'm going there, then the next 2 weeks after that I'm going there? Because if it's shifting mechanically, then the ones who are under Pétain in Verdun would also be at a different place at a different time.
No, you mean across battles and things? No, I mean, it's literally like you read these diaries and they said, okay, so today we're going there. And then, oh, at midday, we were told to go there. And it's just...
and those decisions were random. It wasn't after a strategy, we shift you around the country or something like that, or, you know, with a pattern.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of these things are, you know, Joffre takes this decision and it's negotiation between different generals and what they think is important. So, you know, Joffre was obsessed with the Somme. And I mean, these things were crazy, right? They could have launched the Somme offensive in spring, but they're, you know, waiting for the Russians to be ready. And so they're going to do in the summer. This is like the kind of strategic consideration that they're dealing with. And then honestly, these line infantry regiments, they don't give a crap. They're just like, these are like these peasant men throughout France. And these are just completely superfluous, disposable material. It's just, I don't think that the level of the strategy is so fine that they really have a plan throughout the war of exactly what's going to happen. I mean, on the 9th of February, they said that the German attack is improbable.
Yeah, I don't mean necessarily that, but if in retrospect, looking back at the war, the ones that were your treatment regiments, would they also have been systematically exposed to some other battle at some point? You know, that's and that you can probably test, because you can see if their rotation in retrospect is really scrambled, or is it sort of,
maybe we could do
5 and I go there and then I go there and then I go there, and 4 goes the same pattern, there, and then perhaps it coincided that I was under Pétain in Verdun, but I was also happened to be, because it was a pattern of rotation, I was at another place that also had some major. It's unlikely, but it might be.
Well, yeah, it's unlikely. And what we know for sure is that you can control for some Chemin des Dames, second battle at the end, and it doesn't change you can control for the whole battle rotation throughout the war, and it doesn't affect the results. But I don't know, but it's a good question whether, so for sure, you know, if you're at Verdun, you're not on the Somme at the same time. So that's for sure that, you know, in that sense, there is a systematic negative correlation. But so, you know, if you're at Verdun under Pétain, you're more likely to be at the Somme, because if you're at Verdun not under Pétain, you're at Verdun later when the Somme offensive actually happens. So you've got these things. But yeah, I think at the end, like if you put all this battle rotation together, it doesn't affect the results. Then, yeah. But I don't know, like we could check. That's a good suggestion to check whether, you know, you're more likely to be at, you know, the Chemin des Dames in 1917 if you're, maybe, I don't know.
And if not, that's great to show, because then it's really
very,
very unlikely that it's something else.
All right, so any more other questions? Well, can I save one question for myself as a host? All right, it's not really about a question, actually. It's about like a nuance in terms of interpreting what is this heroism about. So you have been referring to this as like it has this heroic behavior or records, and then people treat him like a hero, so they believe him. I believe some people really treat him like a hero. But I'm thinking slightly from a different angle to look at this. Like if I serve as a veteran under him, and I knew firsthand that he has a track record. This guy fought against the Germans and he won in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But now even he chose to collaborate with the Germans.
Yeah.
So, and they sent me a very strong signal. I mean, it's not really that it doesn't have to be like I really think this guy is a hero. I kind of follow him blindly. I can do a rational calculation, simply extracting that information. Like this guy won before, but now he is collaborating with this guy. And so, but that's the same result, but it's just a slight tweak in terms of the interpretation.
Well, I think it's the same kind of idea that you have this great trust in this hero, that he's acting selflessly, you know, that what he's doing is the right thing, and that, you know, he's yeah, so I think this is explaining the results, but I think this is one dimension of heroism, right? I mean, heroes are successful. They're not. So heroes is two things: is a costly signal of type, where you signal your commitment to the public good rather than your own good. But it's not only that; it's also you're successful, right? Otherwise, you're not a hero. You're just a nice guy who failed. So I think it is part of the heroism, and I think it's part of the reason why people did this thing and followed him into this. I think what's more interesting is that, like, we really have a very extreme form of collaboration, right? So I think it's one thing to support his regime, is to say, oh, you know, I like him and I'm going to do what he says. It's another thing to join the Gestapo or to join the Waffen-SS And I think, you know, these guys who volunteer to go on the Eastern Front in 1944, I mean, this is, you know, I mean, who does that? It's just like, I think at this point, maybe, yeah. So, but again, like, I think it shows that probably this guy trusted that that was the right thing to do, because Pétain had said that that was the right thing to do. And I think what's interesting from, like, you know, what lesson to take out of this is that you have these people taking, so, you know, like their political values change, and, you know, they're more likely to do these things, but you also have people doing very extreme decisions. And I think, to me, that's kind of dark and scary, right? Because these people take quite extreme political action following this person. It's not just like I put a ballot for a right-wing conservative party compared to for the communists. It's like I joined the Wehrmacht under German uniform in 1944. And like we talk in the paper or in the appendix about like specific individuals, you know, who, like, the head of the milice is actually born in a tiny little village that my paternal family comes from. His name is Joseph Darnan, and it was, you know, big taboo. You know, I would visit my grandmother, and I would, you know, there are some people in the village that you could not talk to or say hi to. You would get slapped in the face. Anyway, so this guy is, so he volunteers for the First World War. He's like lies on his age, and he arrives in Verdun in February 1916, and he serves for Pétain, and he just loves the guy. He calls his own son Philippe. He's super, but he's also, like, he himself is a hero. Like, he has all sorts of military decoration. He saves a lot of people and a lot of soldiers on the front. Like, he comes back from the First World War being, you know, this super brave guy, decorated and everything. And he loves Pétain. He calls his son Philippe, and then he joins this veteran organization that are super right wing. And then he's still young enough to fight the German in 1939. And he's captured by the Germans, and he escapes from Germany, and he swears to take revenge on Germany, and he hates the Germans even more than he hated them in the First World War. Like, he hates the Germans. He makes overture to join the resistance, but he's so faithful to Pétain that he actually ends up heading the milice, which is a super violent military paramilitary organization in France. And then he joins the Waffen-SS, and he ends up the war under German uniform. And then he escapes to Nazi Germany, and then he escapes to Italy. He's captured. He's sentenced to death in France. And he writes a letter to de Gaulle the day before his execution, saying, you know, I don't ask for my forgiveness, but I ask forgiveness for the members of the milice, because their only mistake was to have been faithful to a great soldier.
All right, fascinating. Fascinating story. All right, so thank you so much. Great talk, and I really appreciate. We're looking forward to your new book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you know I'm writing a book? Because I was postponing the seminar.
Yeah. We saw that advertisement. I think everybody see the advertisement. You're writing a book, and we're looking forward to it.
Okay, cool. It's in French though, but.
Oh, really? Okay. Hopefully.
Well, I hope one day we'll be trying. It's just that my editor is French, but
okay. And
it was a fun thing to do.
Yep.
To write in your native language. I advise that to anybody, by the way. It's you know, it's it's something different from what we do. I don't know. I found myself a lot more creative in French than I am in English, and it's just,
Okay.
it was a fun thing. Thank you.
Yeah. And hopefully in the future you have a chance to visit us in Perth.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah.
I've never
Okay.
been to Perth.
Really? Wow, what a shame.
I don't think I've ever been, further than Adelaide.
Yeah.
On